camp while we wait for our attendees to join in. Here they come. And live. Recording. Perfect. Well, as folks trickle on in, I'll go ahead and get us started this evening. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining our live virtual event tonight with writers and educators Geraldine Woods and JP Kemmick. I'm Jessica from the Country Bookshelf in Bozeman, Montana, coming to you from the ancestral unceded lands of the Apsalaki Crow, Salish Kootenai, Cheyenne, Shoshone Bannock, and Ocheti Shokoan peoples. We encourage those of you joining us from outside Bozeman and Montana to learn more about the land that you occupy and the stories of its people. We are grateful to be here in this virtual space with our fellow Books in Common Northwest stores, Paulina Springs Books in Sisters, Oregon, and Madison Books in Seattle, Washington. Be sure to visit booksincommonnw.com for more information and follow us on Eventbrite to register for more great Books in Common events. Before we get to our speakers this evening, I wanted to point out a few things about our virtual space. In coming soon in the chat, you will find a link to booksincommonnw.com where you can go to purchase your copy of either of Jerry's books. You may recognize her from our event last year for 25 great sentences, but we'll be discussing sentence, period, this evening. A guide to building better readers and writers, which is delightful for us here at the Country Bookshelf. We are recording this event and it will be viewable later on the Books in Common NW YouTube channel after the event concludes. If you run into technical glitches along the way and exiting and re-entering the webinar doesn't resolve that for you, you can still watch live on that YouTube stream. So that's sort of our secondary recommendation if you have any of those technical issues. If you have any questions for our panelists, which I hope you do, you can submit them by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen or drop them in the chat and we'll get to them as time allows at the end here. I do want to remind everyone that this is a shared creative space that we want to remain safe for everyone and ask that you be respectful of all that have joined us this evening. Offensive or inappropriate comments or questions will see the user dismissed from the space. So without further ado, Geraldine Woods has taught English at every level from 5th grade through advanced placement, most recently at the Horace Mann School. She is the author of numerous nonfiction books for adults and children, including, I hate it, 25 Great Sentences, and now Sentence. She lives in New York City. JP Kemmick grew up just a stone's throw away from us here in Bozeman in Billings, Montana. He has been working as a youth writing mentor across the Northwest for over a decade. He holds an MFA in fiction from the University of Montana and is currently at work on a novel about love, cults, and tunneling to the center of the planet. So when not writing, he's usually on a bike. Without further ado, Jerry, JP, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be with you again. Thank you. And JP as well. I'm glad to meet you virtually.
Thank you, Jessica. I'm not sure I connected the Bozeman connection. I have definitely spent some happy hours in that bookstore in Bozeman as well. So that's fun. Geraldine, so excited to talk with you tonight. I've actually been spending time in a physical classroom with real live students recently. I'm on a long-term sub position with a private school here in Seattle, teaching geography, which is certainly not my forte, but I keep on bringing an English lens into that classroom. The students are like, oh, what kind of teacher? I'm an English teacher. So it's been a lot of fun kind of doing a super deep dive into the minutia of sentences with your book. So like Jessica was saying, you've taught for a long time at a number of different schools. And I guess one of my questions for you is, have you always been a nut for sentences, or the longer you taught, did that kind of create a narrowing of focus for you? How did you come to focus so intensely on sentences?
I think that's a good question, by the way. I think I've always been a nut for language. I was the kind of kid that would read the cereal box instead of looking for the toy, or I would, fall down the stairs because I was reading a book and I didn't want to stop reading it, things like that. So that's been part of my life, straight through my life. In terms of teaching English, I actually taught Spanish for a while, and I taught social studies for a while, but I was pretty bad at teaching social studies because all I was really interested in was the literature of the country that we were supposedly studying. But I think that I'm very interested in sentences, but I don't want to give the impression that that's the only thing I do when I teach, or the only thing that I think about. I tend to think about the language a lot, and a sentence is a nice digestible nibble. Like, you can do a lot if you just look at a sentence and you look at a technique in maybe 10 sentences by different authors using the same technique, you get a lot out of it. So it's a very approachable way, but certainly when I'm teaching a class, in general, if I've got them with me for a long time, then we're reading full works and writing full-length things as well. But it's just a nice way in. I think a sentence is probably the smallest expression from which you can distinguish the writer's style. So if I want to look at two writers, and Virginia Woolf and Hemingway, to pick two rather different writers, if I want to really see what their style is like, I would pick a sentence from each. And in fact, I have actually in the books, just to see how do they do it, because they're just really different. And yet a lot of times they're using the same technique to get an idea across. So it's a focus of these two books, but it's not all of me. I can trip out on a word. Before the pandemic, I was in Dublin, Ireland, and I was in their Museum of Archaeology. And I'm looking at an exhibit and I see a little sign and it says, "Mind the plinth." So I'm thinking, wow, they really trust their tourists because plinth, and then I thought, do I know what a plinth is? And I wasn't 100% certain. And I had to go back to check my phone and do some research and find out what a plinth was. And so it's that kind of thing where I just, start spinning out into language. And of course I tripped over the plinth because I was thinking about the definition rather than actually where I was physically. But sentences are just a nice door. You can open that door and it's not too intimidating, and you can get in there and then think about things. And as a teacher, when I first started teaching, I had really no clue what I was doing at all. I really no clue. I mean, I was stood in front of the kids and I thought, oh my God, I'm the grown up and I have to do something my first day of teaching. So I threw out all these really big questions and I just didn't get very far. And then if I took one sentence and we picked that apart, that became a way to expand to a larger work. So it was a nice door, I think.
I think we're here with a books in common reading, and it struck me that you were saying that sentences and their most foundational elements have so much in common, regardless of who the writer is. They're all using the same tools that we have available to us in the English language. And whenever I end an English class, whether I'm teaching a week-long, creative writing class, or a semester-long, 8th grade language arts class, I tell my students, you're going to need this. Whether you're, the next great American novelist, or you're just writing emails to your boss asking for a raise, the English language and these tools are the basis of a pretty limited set of ways that we have to communicate. And so I love that idea of kind of understanding the foundation of language through sentences.
And you're talking about power to express themselves. And I think that's key. And also key, I think, is understanding what manipulations are being done on them. I mean, there's millions of dollars spent on advertising and political campaigns and all the other ways that groups that want to get a message across for a particular effect. And if you're going to have all that kind of energy going into the crafting a message, you may buy the message without understanding exactly what you bought because you got, kind of pulled in by the way it's phrased. All that money has actually worked and people are able to convince you. Yeah. So once you understand what's happening, you can kind of push that curtain aside and actually say, well, do I agree with that or not? Is that something that really matters to me?
Right.
Do I believe that? So I think it gives power both ways. One to get your ideas across, and the other is to kind of decode what's being used on you,
Right.
and then perhaps see things a little bit more clearly.
And I think that students forget sometimes that somebody wrote that Doritos chips script, right? Somebody is not, they don't just film it and have no idea what they're going to say, but somebody had to do the writing of that messaging. And I think the book does a great job at talking about cross-disciplinary work. Like you were just all of a sudden into media literacy, and it of course touches on all of the core elements like grammar, but talks about how to intertwine this with science lessons and geography lessons and math lessons even, which I think is great. So many schools right now are really emphasizing that cross-disciplinary approach. And I think that sometimes English teachers think, okay, well, I'll rope in the social studies teacher. They're doing a lesson on immigration right now, and we can read a memoir about immigrating. But to stretch it into these other disciplines and think creatively about how to join them, I think is difficult, and I think is something that the book really has some great touch points for.
Well, thank you, first of all. I think it's really a great thing that people are becoming more interdisciplinary, because in a sense, we've created separate silos of knowledge, separate threads, and they're not really separated in real life. I mean, if you're a mathematician, you've got to understand whatever it is you're looking at, and then you've got to explain it to somebody. Otherwise, you're just talking inside your own head.
Sure.
So I think the disciplines are woven together. We're the ones that have pulled them apart artificially. So it's not really creating anything new. It's just more repairing the damage that was done by putting it together. And I think, the history one is obvious. Anytime I've seen an interdisc course, or often I have seen them during my career, it's been, okay, well, we're studying American history this year. What can you guys in English do to, support our historical era that we're looking at, or something like that. But just there is a lot more, even just looking at works of art. If you're looking at something like a very simply expressed sentence, there's a one sentence from a novel where there's a young man who's very troubled. The book is called Okay for Now by Gary Schmidt. And the young man has a very troubled home life, and he goes to the library and he sees this Audubon drawing, and the sentence is "the terrified eye," and that's the whole sentence. There's a lot left out there, but what's in there? He's terrified, and the bird is not actually. The bird is a predator, and so he's just focused. But this boy has a lot missing in this perception of the world. He doesn't quite understand what's going on. He's a middle school kid. So you put that next to Constantine Brancusi's Bird in Space, which is just basically a gleaming cylinder that's slightly twisted. And you look at how a visual artist or a sculptor has done simplicity, and then how a writer has done simplicity. It's really pretty cool to think about other ways of thinking. Language exists because we exist, and the world exists. So there's a lot out there to relate it to.
My wife, who was a art history major, and I met at our MFA in fiction, I think would very much agree with that thinking. I was also so impressed by just the range of sentences that you've gathered. And from just a collector standpoint, I'm curious, have you been squirreling away sentences forever? Did you go into hyperdrive just for this particular book? And before you answer, if I can just read my favorite one. If there's no money in poetry, neither is there poetry in money, which is attributed to Robert Graves. And it's just a quick little power of a couple sentences. I thought that was a keeper for me.
Oh, I'm glad. I like that one too. That was from a lecture he gave at the London School of Economics. And of course, one time at Horace Mann, which is the school I taught at for most of my career, they had career day, and a poet came. And, there's the attorneys and the Wall Street guys and the doctors and the whatevers. And then there's the poet over on the corner there. And he's like, okay, you can probably make in the high two figures if you really try. But yeah, that's a Robert Graves sentence. To answer your question, it's a little of each. When I've teach a book, I'm writing all over it and I'm making notes about where I want to start. And as I said, the sentence is for me often the entry point. I'll start a class by saying, just look at this one sentence. Now let's see what we're talking about. And then it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger as they talk about whatever they're reading. So I had a whole bunch of those kinds of things. And I'm a language nerd. So the plinth thing, I took a picture of the sign and put it on my blog and, wrote down my notes about plinth and what it means and things like that. So I have a pretty hefty file cabinet, but I also knew when I started working on this, once you understand there's a certain element in a sentence, so both books, they're basically, I picked 25 elements, 25 things, tools that a writer can use. And I have a focus on a couple in depth, and then I just have a whole bunch of other ones just to show the range, because I think that's kind of interesting thing to see. So for any element, like when I was looking for negativity, for negative statements, well, I found them everywhere. I just kind of looked through my bookshelf. I went to the library. I browsed around. Pre-pandemic, I was allowed out and I could do stuff. The minute I started looking for something, it was everywhere. And then I, polled my friends and my friends' children and my own grandchildren, what are you listening to in music? And I started listening to Billie Eilish. I found a whole bunch of stuff there, and things that are not in because I'm old. So my frame of reference for music is 60s and 70s, not Billie Eilish now. Although I actually thought some of her stuff was really good.
I think she just turned 19. So yeah,
right.
They get younger and younger in the pop sphere.
They do, and I don't, but I do reach out so I can learn a few things. So I did a little bit of combination of reaching out, saying, well, let me look at some stuff that what's going on now, and then some things I already had. But it's just not that hard to find. I mean, if you open your ears and you pay attention, I don't know if there's any. I think there are many teachers who start this way, but it's certainly an easy thing to do. If whatever your class happens to be reading, just start with a sentence and go from there, either as a model for writing or a model or something you want to pick apart for reading, to see what technique the writer has been using and what else is in there for you to think about.
And I know I already emphasized this, but just to hammer this one more time, we have Taylor Swift, Emerson, and Yoda. Like there's a pretty serious breadth. And I love the idea of Yoda because obviously he's got a very particular and fairly famous speech pattern. But I would never have thought, well, there's something to be said about the English language in there. But you do an entire little breakdown of how Yoda is speaking, what that can tell us about the way that he is phrasing. I mean, it was an impressive Yoda little chapter in there. I loved it.
Well, thank you. I relied on, I have a small network of people who have seen every movie 7,000 times. And so I was able to talk with them a little bit. And I actually did a little research into Jedi Knights. I did this during this pre-pandemic. I did this during the Super Bowl, which is, I think, cementing my nerd credentials pretty much. But I just thought it was really interesting because George Lucas said that he wanted Yoda to sound like an alien. So he on purpose manipulated the speech. So that part's easy to see. But I think that I think writers put a lot in that they have no idea they're putting in. I think that, when you're really writing and you're a good writer, and I would put George Lucas in that category, I think you work partly from a subconscious level. And so a whole bunch of stuff comes out and it sounds right to you and you maybe can't articulate why it sounds right. But then somebody else comes in and starts looking at it. So for the Yoda sentence, which is much to learn, you still have. And what I think is really interesting there is the learning comes before the individual, before the you, because learning is more important. Yoda's a teacher. So yay, teachers. And Yoda's teaching about the force, which is, there's something bigger than you, like that your individual self, your ego, your personality is not as important as this force of life. So I thought it was a pretty neat thing that George Lucas did there.
I love how you just expanded that context as well, because on so many of the lessons, you start off with limited context. Maybe you'll tell your students a thing or two about the context of that sentence, but then you also have a section right after that is the expanded context, which is sort of a way to ease students out of that super hyper detailed phase of exploring that sentence and into thinking about what it might mean in the larger context of the work, which I feel like we often do the reverse. We say, what is the theme of this novel? Right. And then we kind of maybe work it down to some evidence for a paper, which maybe is getting us to that sentence level. But you reversed that, which I think is probably refreshing.
I think that came from my own experience. As I said, when I started, so I get out of college, I need a job, but I want to go to Europe with my friends and I have no money. So I think, okay, if I get a teaching job, then I can just go and come back, and I'll come back on Labor Day and I'll start teaching the next day and it'll be cool. So this is how you think when you're 21. So I did that, and I showed up and I stood in front of the classroom and I thought, oh no, what am I supposed to do? So I started with all these big ideas. So the kids are reading Lord of the Flies, and I say, tell me about your ideal society. And I think this is going to be, because it's such an intense book about personal freedom and collective responsibility. And there, it's like nothing, they say everybody will be happy and we're done, no one will have homework. Now we're really done. And I couldn't get anywhere that way. And maybe a more skilled teacher could have done so, but that wasn't me at that point. So I would take one sentence and just say, tell me about this and tell me what you see, and go outward from there. So it came partly from being flat-footed and jet-lagged when I first started teaching, but it sort of, for me, just began to work so much better that I stayed with it. And I still often, after they've done a bunch, then I'll have that discussion. Talk to me now. What do you think? Well, what about this and what about that? And so we can get to the bigger ideas, but I don't tend to start there.
I guess after if you do enough small sentences in a book, you're probably going to start piecing some bigger ideas together and working your way up to a theme from that point anyway. So that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think that's like, for example, Virginia Woolf. You could just throw a dart at that book, and at Mrs. Dalloway, for example, or To the Lighthouse. Almost anything that she's written, you throw a dart blindfolded, and you're going to hit a sentence that really matters. Because again, I think she was probably working partly subconsciously, although she definitely crafted her work. It's not just, let's just all spill it and then, now we're done and have a picnic and forget about it. I think she spent a lot of time shaping her things. But I think what she did is she embedded all these themes in so much of what she wrote. It just keeps coming back more and more and more. And I'm not even sure if she was able to understand how much she was putting in, but it's definitely in there. When she wrote To the Lighthouse, it came out, it's one of my favorite books. And all the critics were asking her what the lighthouse was. And she held up the book and she said, this is my answer. Like, I can't get any more specific than this, and that makes sense to me, because you can't really pin it down. That's sort of the beauty of that sort of writing, where everything's a tentacle going somewhere.
Yeah, I think she's a bit of an unpinnable writer.
Yeah.
Any way you look at it. One of the things I also appreciated about the book, despite your focus on sentences and their power and how much they can teach us, you also sort of acknowledge that point where students might start pulling their hair out and say, enough. Like, we have hammered this one sentence as much as we can. We've pounded it into the ground. Can we please move on? And I'm curious, from your long experience teaching, did you ever encounter that when you weren't done with the sentence? Did you ever want to say, we're gonna stick with this one for a second longer? Or were students so attuned to it and you kind of wanted to move on to something else? Like, how did you navigate that enough realm?
I didn't always navigate it very successfully. I'll admit that right off the bat. Teaching is a relationship. There's, and language is what we use for, at least one really important tool for a relationship. So talking about something for too long, the kids would roll their eyes or whatever, and they keep it real, and that's really helpful. If I thought there was something really important, then I would try to come at it through a different door, because things do connect. So if they've had it with one sentence, it's like, fine, let's move on. And then later it's like, oh, by the way, remember that other thing? How does that relate to this? And kind of do it that way. I think that the more dangerous trap is to read too much into something. I had a class in poetry, and we would read a whole bunch of poems by one poet, and then the poet would come to the class and visit. So it was really nice, a very humbling experience for me as a teacher. So there was one fellow who was, we read his poem, and the personal pronoun I was capitalized in every line but one. So we spent maybe 45 minutes with all these theories about why that line. And we had so many ideas. So he comes in, and it was the first thing we asked him, and he goes, "Oh, that's a typo." It's a really good way to get your, head back into the game and your feet on the ground, you're floating away into the stratosphere.
I was really interested. The first half of the book or more is really prose heavy. Most of your examples are from novels, maybe song lyrics, but I just noticed kind of an absence of poetry. And for me, the reason I'm a prose writer and a fiction writer, regardless of how many ideas I have for poems, is I've never had the type of laser focus that all of my poet friends have, that they can, spend days on a line, or they collect, hundreds of lines, and they somehow file them away on their computer and try and piece them together. And that just hyper focus on individual lines that poets have is something that I know I've struggled with. And I'm curious if there was any thinking on your part about including more poetry or less poetry. Does poetry count as, focusing on the sentence level? Because are they sentences or are they lines? Just your thinking about including poetry versus prose.
I think poems do have sentences. If you think of a sentence as a unit of expression, it just may be arranged differently. So on the page, so the visual effect of it is often important, or the audio, the listening to the sounds of the poem. Although I think that's true in prose as well. I think that I didn't consciously have less from poems than from novels, but I think there's kind of two things in there. One is that people don't generally think of sentences in poems, and that's kind of a mistake. And the other is just that prose also deserves that kind of focus. I just think a really well-written speech or an essay or a nonfiction book or a novel or short story, those sentences deserve attention as well, because they have that art. They have artistry and beauty or an important message to communicate. So I probably went a little bit too far in that direction, because people don't tend to look at prose with that kind of attention, and I think they should.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like you were saying, your class spent 45 minutes on a typo. So right. I do love that. Occasionally my wife and I, if we're reading novels, before going to bed, we'll say, "Can I just read you one sentence?" But not nearly as much as with poetry. So that makes a lot of sense. I know we don't have a ton of time left, and we did have a question from one of our attendees that I love, because I think it's an impossible to answer question. So I'm going to throw that on you. It's, what is the essence of a well-crafted sentence? And what makes a bad sentence? If there is such a thing, which I think there is.
I agree with you. I think there is. I think the essence of a well-crafted sentence is one that does its job, and it might have a different job depending on what it's doing. So if the sentence is in a story and it's illuminating character, for example, or advancing plot, or if the sentence is in a speech and it's intended to move you, FDR's inaugural address, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. I mean, that's only the heart of the sentence. It's longer than that, and it's magnificent because it's doing its job. And its job is to give hope to a country that's broken. He takes office with the Great Depression and the stock market crash and 20% of the country out of work, and it's a mess. And he's got to get people believing and understanding. So what he's doing in that sentence, and what a short story is doing or The Terrified Eye, when you just want to into that character's mind. So a well-crafted sentence is one that accomplishes its purpose and does its job. And a bad sentence is one that doesn't. So I think, and you can be bad for a bunch of reasons. I think you can be bad because you're not true to your own voice. I sometimes when I'm teaching, there's someone who has memorized 1,000 words for the SAT or the ACT or something like that. And by golly, I'm going to use them, because they took the vocabulary section out and I'm stuck with all these words. So, I'm going to put like 15 5-syllable words in this sentence because I got to get some use out of it. Well, that's a terrible sentence because it doesn't resemble anything remotely like real life.
It's
so
also
it's
probably not doing its job either, because it got so caught up in being over much that it forgot what its job was, right?
Yeah, and it doesn't sound like a real person. I think, unless you're writing about a robot, and the whole core of the earth thing, I really would like to read that and find out, is there a robot taking us to the core of the earth? That would be kind of interesting to know. But I think, you want to sound like an actual person, and, whatever, either the character you're creating or yourself, if you're just speaking your own thoughts. So yeah, I think those are the well-crafted sentence and the poorly crafted one.
Yeah, I love that as a succinct answer. I couldn't have come up with it so astutely. So it's almost as if you studied sentences even longer than I have.
I'm pretty sure I've done almost everything even longer than you have. I'm pretty old.
That's fair.
Well, I'm going to piggyback off of that question because I recall, about this time last year when we were talking about 25 great sentences. And I'm curious if you just decided to write sentence to pick those gems that didn't make the 25 cut off the floor and be able to shine some light on that.
It's interesting because I kind of wrote sentence first and then the 25 great sentences second, sort of. I had this, I wrote them pretty much together, is the short answer. And my initial plan for the sentence, the one we're talking about now, this one, was just to help teachers figure out how to teach this way, which I think I actually carried out. But I found myself just wanting to spend a lot more time thinking and talking about discussing the sentences, just because there's just so much about them. And I didn't, and there's very little overlap. I think that's just because, even now, I was getting ready for another webinar kind of thing. And I just found all these sentences last week in, reading the New Yorker or reading the New York Times or a novel or whatever, and I'm pulling even more things out. And then I taught a few classes at Hugo House, by Zoom. And I'm listening to these wonderful sentences thinking, wow, I really wish I had a copy of that, that's like really cool what people have written. So it's not the B side. It's more like they were kind of like parallel lines. And then, I ended up getting the 25 great sentences one together first, and then this one immediately following. But they're pretty much a pair.
They are, and sort of to JP's point, as you were talking about the broader application of this, when you presented 25 sentences, I was actually in a class for publishing professionals. And I was like, everyone, you have to go watch this YouTube link because I think this is absolutely perfect for editors and agents and writers too. It's not just for the English teacher. And I do appreciate much the way JP did that sort of broader scope that you apply. And very early on in the book, I feel like it's chapter 4, that interdisciplinary play starts to come around. And I like that it is play. Because
I think, thank you, first of all. It's going to my head here, I won't fit in the screen. I think that, a couple of things. Playing is fun, and kids pick up language and they play with language. They make words up when they, because they don't have it. JP, I know you have a little one in your house, and you'll be watching this, and it'll be really interesting to just see how your child learns language and what he starts to say with it, and all the things that he uses it for, and how kids are, it's hardwired into us somehow. I don't understand the science of it, and I'm not sure that we totally do, even experts, but you don't have to sit down and say, okay, you are now going to learn your nouns to your son. He's just going to learn them, and he's just going to use it. And I think it's nice to dissect stuff and to name the parts of speech and to do all that kind of thing, but it can be counterproductive. It can be a wall between that and walling off the fun, and that's a shame. I think of writers, really good writers, as they have this sort of sandbox, and they're playing with stuff, and they're just seeing what happens. What would happen if I did this or if I did that, and if we can capture that and keep that and not beat it out of them with you have to have a subject, verb, and a complete thought and a proper period. They have to learn stuff like that, because I think our society uses that sort of standard English rule as a gatekeeper. It's kind of unfortunate, actually, but I think that's what happens. And it's unfortunate because there's so much expression that doesn't fit that. That's just wonderful. So you've got to teach that, because you don't want to send people out there and have them be at a disadvantage when they're applying for a job or another educational opportunity. But if you kill the joy of it, that's a crime. Somehow you have to allow that joy to just flourish. And well, you're a book person, and so are you, JP, and so am I. And we have all this joy in that, and I'd like to have that continue with the next generation, rather than see that people might lose some of that.
I was talking to an English teacher friend a couple days ago, and we were stressing the importance of teaching grammar, and how, because of the pandemic, a lot of grammar didn't get taught. And then we also both firmly agreed that whenever the teaching of grammar or understanding of grammar gets in the way of a student just writing, putting like pen on the paper, that's when we have a problem. If they're like, oh, I don't really understand exactly where my prepositional phrase should go, I think I'm done with this essay. I can't do it. You go, whoa, we can overcome the little grammar hurdles. Please keep writing.
Yeah. I think that when people are writing, there's a kind of creative power, and the editor has to go out for a cup of coffee and come back later. and then, because they fight, the creative part of your brain and the logical, all right, where do I put the period and, quotation marks or whatever, that has to come in at some point, but that should come in later. In terms of the, prepositional phrase, it's sort of, to my mind, I like all that terminology. I know the terminology. I, was taught by nuns with really long rulers, and, had to learn all this and diagram everything. And it's a nice intellectual house to sit in and think about. It's not actually that necessary. I think most of the time, if you're talking about meaning and you're talking about standard expression, and then you can say, okay, well, if you say me and him are going to this supermarket or whatever, that would be the way you talk to your friends. Now, when you say it in a formal situation, you're going to have to switch. And kids do. I mean, I'd be standing in standing in front of a class, and I'd see two kids say exactly that. Me and him are going to the cafeteria. You want to come? And then they turn around to me and they would say, he and I would like to be excused now because we haven't had lunch. Like they've just switched. They've got they have two things going on there, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it's kind of a shame if we stay only in one realm. I like openness.
Definitely. Well, those of you that are sort of gobbling this up like I am, if you have a question for Jerry or JP, you can drop that in the Q&A section just at the bottom of your screen, or pop it into the chat. I am also curious, because you mentioned Virginia Woolf and a few other writers, and I'm curious what you're reading these days that's really sparking that sort of joy of the sentence. And JP, you answer too.
JP, go first so I can.
I'm reading Ishiguro's new novel, right now, Clara and the Sun. And he's an interesting author for me in that The Buried Giant, which is his kind of allegorical, it's about like the Balkan conflicts, but it's a fantasy novel. And he's a Nobel Prize winning author, and then he writes fantasy, and people are going, "What are you doing?" But it's a gorgeous book with super deep meaning. And I've read a couple others, and I know he's a brilliant writer, and I haven't gotten on board yet. So it's interesting to me that one novel, I reread it recently and it still moved me. Clara and the Sun, he's a very simplistic writer. I would say that none of his sentences have been ones that I've been repeating to my wife at night. They're borderline flat. They're so simple. And I honestly I'm about halfway through the novel and I'm not exactly sure what it's about. So the jury is out on that still. But I just also simultaneously started Pilgrim at Tinker Creek by Annie Dillard, because I saw it in a little free library across the street.
I love that book.
And that's a sentence by sentence reread for me. Just absolutely gorgeous writing. And speaking about, being so laser focused on something, there was an entire page about watching a frog sitting. And I love the super quiet focus of that book. I have a 20-month-old son, so there's not a lot of quiet focus around my house. So very different books, but that's what I'm reading right now.
Well, I have a couple of things going on at the same time. Pandemic has kept me in the apartment so much more than I would be otherwise. So I need to kind of say, okay, I'm doing something different now. So I'll go to a different chair and pick up a different book. It somehow puts a little structure that outside activities used to add to my day. So when I want to get serious, right now I'm working my way through George Saunders' A Swim in a Pond in the Rain.
It's been sitting on my nightstand for about 2 months now, and I'm really excited for it.
It's so wonderful. I just, wow. I would love to be in that man's class. I mean, I don't write short stories, and I don't actually want to write short stories. It's not my preferred genre, but I would like to just sit like a fly on the wall and watch him teach. So that's when I'm going to have like this serious moment when I'm doing that. When I get a little, the world is too much with us kind of moment, which has happened quite a bit in the last year, then there's a Barbara Kingsolver's new book of poetry, How to Fly in 10,000 Easy Lessons. I think something like that is the title. And I just keep turning to that. I find a lot of really great lines in that. I really enjoy reading that. And then when I'm just like, okay, I'm fried or whatever, I'm reading a lot of science fiction. So right now I'm reading the Harry Dresden series, Jim Butcher's. I'm working my way through that. And so I've got, it depends on what mood I'm in and what I need from my brain at that particular moment of the day. What about you, Jessica?
I was very excited to hear you say you're reading Harry Dresden.
I love those books.
Definitely a fun world to play around in and a great sandbox. I, especially through this pandemic time, I think reading for so many people has been very difficult, and mine has definitely come in waves and spurts. But the poet Ross Gay did an essay collection in the winter of 2020 called The Book of Delights. And it sounds trite from a salesperson's kind of perspective, but it is truly delightful. And, he set out to write as a writing exercise, just to write about something, each day that delighted him. And so you get things that you would expect, like a sunset or kids playing in the street or something like that. But then you get really unexpected things, like watching a Confederate statue be taken down in a town that he's visiting. And my personal favorite is about traveling on an airplane with a tomato plant. But he does have kind of an interesting poet's sensibility to the sentence and with the ideas that he's communicating and creating. So that one just lives on my bedside table, and I'll just open it up because a lot of them are just like 1 or 2 pages. So I'll just be like, I'm going to read something nice and to put in my brain before I fall asleep.
One of the things that I miss quite a bit because of the pandemic, one of my main reading places is on public transportation. I live in Manhattan, so I don't have a car. And I, pre-pandemic would go out pretty often, and I would take really long bus rides, and just that would be my time. I could just read, and it would just be so nice. And I've lost that. I hope it will come back at some point. But that was a big chunk of my reading time. I think that's why I found myself, I had to find a different spot in the apartment to read in, just to say, okay, now it's the afternoon, so now I'm going to be on the green couch or something like that. Put a little structure in a very unstructured day.
Well, and some geography in a very small space, like moving from one room to the next and things like that. So
The apartment commute.
yes.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, the pandemic hit New York pretty hard, and especially last spring, and people who were fortunate enough to be able to work from home, and of which I'm one. I mean, I'm very fortunate in that kind of thing. But I could see, if I look out my window, I see maybe 200 apartments, 200 people's lives, because not a lot of people pull their blinds. And all of a sudden, all these little home offices sprang up all over the place.
Yeah. Geraldine, we have another Q&A question for you
Yeah.
from our folks watching from home. It's, what are some of your favorite first sentences from novels? The first sentence can set the tone for a story. Larry McMurtry stated that he wrote the first sentence of Lonesome Dove before he even thought of the story. Which I can see happening. That's happened to me once or twice.
Well, J.R.R. Tolkien, of Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, the whole thing, the first sentence of The Hobbit, before he had the story, before he had anything, he said, came to him when he was marking student essays. In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. Which, by the way, I love that sentence, because you go through that. He makes this world, so he's taking you through this pathway into it, and then you get to meet the hobbit. Yeah.
That's in the book.
That's the first sentence. Yeah, that's the first sentence of the whole thing.
That's in your book.
Yes, it's in my book. Yeah, and it's the first. And it's the first sentence of that multi-million-dollar franchise. So while you're marking essays, JP, may that happen to you.
Yeah, student essays have never inspired a lot of creativity for me personally, but
I think it's a kind of defiance. Like, I have to read, another 20 essays on a piece of literature that I used to like before I read the 20 essays. Yeah. So I'm going to come up with something creative. But to answer the question, I think Call Me Ishmael. It is a truth universally acknowledged. The Jane Austen first sentence of Pride and Prejudice. Those are amazing. I don't know. Those are the two that come to mind that just sort of grab you and yank you in. But Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself. That one, probably a few more too. But those come to mind immediately.
Mm-hmm.
What comes to your mind, JP?
I was just preparing a lesson on Slaughterhouse Five last night. And what's fascinating about that book is that it starts off introducing a character who gets shot for stealing a teapot after surviving the bombing of Dresden. And then it ends with a very quick, and yeah, that really did happen. That man really was shot. Isn't that absurd? But he doesn't appear anywhere else in the novel. So it's an interesting case in, Vonnegut kind of screwing up the chronology, the standard Western rollout of plot development. And I think the first novel, Slaughterhouse Five, is all of this really did happen more or less, which is a great way to start Slaughterhouse Five, because of course there's all kinds of ridiculous nonsense all the way throughout it, including, time traveling aliens. And to start off that book, this all really happened. And to also have that be true for portions of the novel, because of course Vonnegut and his real experiences in World War II are scattered throughout, as is a crazy science fiction novel. So it's kind of a ballsy way to start off, and also the only way I can imagine that book starting. And, for a long time, he said that when people asked him what he was working on, he says, my big Dresden novel. I'm writing my big Dresden novel. And you can see him trying all of the standard, big thought ways to write that novel, like a great American novelist would, and finally kind of settling on the weird, warped way that his beautiful brain, of course, works, and coming to throwing himself in there and saying, this all happened, and I'm going to tell you about my experience. So it's pretty
How
good.
about you, Jessica? What are your favorite first lines?
I have always appreciated Neil Stephenson's "The moon blew up suddenly and without warning" from Seven Eves, and of kind of for a similar sort of absurdist. And he does kind of a similar thing too, where you travel back before the moon explodes, and then you move from moon exploding forward. And then the gunslinger fled into the desert, and the man in black followed, from Stephen King's the Dark Tower series. Those two live kind of rent free in my head. I feel like some of my other favorite lines that live rent free are not the first line. So that's always tough.
Pre-pandemic, I went to a lecture by Robert Caro, the historian and biographer. He's an amazing writer. And he was talking about his extremely thick book on Robert Moses, The Power Broker. And he said that he was actually interviewing Moses or trying to get access and, following this man around and until he had the information. He's famous for tracking down every detail. But the whole book came together in his head when he went to some sort of public event, and Moses was looking at all these people and he said, "Why don't they like me?" And that's the last sentence of his book. And so that's kind of the opposite, but that the entire thing comes into focus. Why don't they like me? As Moses started off, Robert Moses was the urban planner and power broker who wanted to turn New York City into a set of superhighways and ruin all these neighborhoods, and succeeded in part, but fortunately was turned back and by a lot of angry people. And why don't they like me? But that put the whole thing in perspective for him. And so I think last lines are really pretty interesting also. That's definitely up there for me. Also, by the time I think it's about 1,000 pages, that book. So by the time you get there, you've really earned it.
Yes.
But it's definitely worth the trip. And it's a magnificent book.
I feel like that's true of the questioner's Lonesome Dove as well.
Yes.
By the time you get there, you've really earned it. Well, I don't see any more questions. I'm going to speak really slowly so that if anyone wants to dive in last minute. But thank you both so much for joining us this evening. Again, if you haven't picked up your copy of Sentence, or even 25 Great Sentences, you can buy them together. Just visit booksincommonnw.com and click on the logo of your favorite sponsoring store. Some of the other novels that we had discussed tonight have found their way into the chat, so you can find those links there. Geraldine, JP, thank you so much for joining us and sharing this fabulous book with me, or with us.
Well, thank you so much. I want to make a little plug for independent bookstores. I think that there are lots of places that you can buy books, and I understand that, but it's really nice to have in your community, to have a gathering space like an independent bookstore. So please buy your books if you can at one of the sponsors for this evening, because we need them. We need them very much, more than ever, I think.
Yes.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for Jessica for hosting. Thank you very much, Geraldine, for writing a very, very focused book. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I'll be bringing it into my classrooms.
Well, thank you both. This has been lovely. And thank you to the people who have been listening in. Stay safe, everybody, and take care of each other.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.